Contra: The Alien Wars for Game Boy, released in 1994 courtesy of Konami and developed by Factor 5, themselves responsible for some quality Turrican and Star Wars titles on the various Nintendo consoles among other things, is an abridged adaptation of the SNES run-and-gun classic of the same name, minus the Roman numeral 3, a second player, a whole level, and a whole bunch of other stuff that was dropped to make this game possible on the old Game Boy. But this does have Super Game Boy compatibility, which adds some color bits and enhances some of the sound effects, and there's also a password system, which is convenient if nothing else. But yeah, this is a Game Boy 8-bit monochrome port of a 16-bit Super Nintendo game, particularly one that really pushed that system's capabilities. And I'll tell you what, regardless of the end product, you cannot deny the game's ambition and balls for even existing. Unfortunately, even with the concessions made to make this port even possible, I think Alien Wars turned out pretty good. Now let's get some worthless details out of the way. Contra: The Alien Wars on Game Boy features 5 of the original version's 6 levels, the 3 side-scrolling levels and the 2 overhead levels. Those hoping for some motorbike riding action will be left out. The overhead levels lack the whole screen-turning Mode 7 gimmick of the SNES version, which is no real loss. Never really cared for that bit, but then again, I never really cared for those levels to begin with. Give me something more traditional, like in Super C. You can no longer swap between 2 weapons. There are fewer boss battles here than in the original version, or so I'm told. There are generally fewer weapons you could pick out. I think they're just missing the laser and maybe a couple others, but you got the flamethrower, the spreader, the homing missiles, and the exploding bullets. And generally speaking, the overall difficulty does seem a bit lower compared to the original version. Difficulty select toggles how many lives and continues you have available, with easy cutting you off after the 3rd level. Though you can build up your lives count early on in the 1st level by camping out in your tank after destroying the 2nd barrier and letting enemy troops run in from behind to eventually die, and yeah. You poor dumb bastards. Don't get too excited though. You max out at 7 lives and you could also carry up to 5 bombs at most. That's kind of underwhelming. And for those who want it, there's a simple password system that lets you continue where you left off. And the passwords will even keep track of what weapon you're holding as well as your lives and bombs count, which is actually quite neat. Though I'd imagine this is a game that skilled players could probably blow through within a half hour's time, possibly less, possibly more, rounding out here. In any event, whether you're looking for a Game Boy iteration of an SNES classic or merely a follow-up to the Game Boy's own Operation C release from a few years prior, Alien Wars is a rather serviceable offering of Contra Light on the handheld. And really, in terms of recreating that game onto this lesser format, I thought it turned out pretty good, all things considered. Not quite as intense, sure, but in terms of recreating some of the more memorable set pieces and boss battles, Alien Wars does hold its own fairly well. Controls work well enough, the usual mapping with select reserved for dropping bombs, which is something I often keep forgetting at times, but hey, it's there. It's not entirely perfect, however. Sometimes I'll be close to an edge and I'll press the A button to jump, only to instead fall into the abyss below. This happened to me a couple of times and it's always annoying. I'm also not a fan of these overhead levels. Very happy that all the zooming and turning has been excised from this version, but the controlling these sections aren't entirely smooth either. Other than that minor quibble, yeah, this is a fine Contra handheld outing on its own, and a pretty decent downgrade from the SNES original, all things considered. Graphically, Alien Wars doesn't look too shabby. The sprites are slightly bigger than they were in Operation C, but the action is more than accommodating for that. The overhead levels, well, they couldn't do the rotation gimmick in any way, shape, or form, but as is, they look fine, and honestly, I prefer this over the spitty, zoomy shit to begin with, so it doesn't really bother me. A few bosses that made it to the game look mighty impressive. The foreground elements look fine, the backgrounds somewhat less so, but pop this onto a Super Game Boy and you'll get some enhanced color effects on screen, each stage sporting unique palettes and even some extra colors for certain elements like the flames in the first level or the final boss fight even. Certainly looks better than the Game Boy Color's default color setting, which is, yeah. Sound-wise, Alien Wars is adequate, with some respectable renditions of the SNES musical bits, and some sound effects that are the usual quality on par with most decent-sounding Game Boy titles, to put it kindly. playing this on the Super Game Boy. Again, since this is one of those SGB enhanced cartridges and some effort actually went into making better use of this fucking thing, you'll hear some samples of enhanced sound effects here and there, which generally means the explosions sound a bit more impressive at times than the tinny sounds that the Game Boy could produce. Hell, there's even an extra alien growl here and there. It's one of those little touches that makes it worth playing on a Super Game Boy accessory, and a bit of a drawback of the later Game Boy Color/Game Boy Player, which was never designed to take advantage of those Super Game Boy enhanced features. Of course, it begs the question of why you'd play this version on your Super Nintendo when you could play the OG that inspired it, but still, I'd appreciate the extra effort. Here, have a listen. Also, note to self, never say OG again, you sound like an asshole. Fuck's sake. Contra, the Alien Wars on Game Boy. Hey, you know what? This was pretty damn good, all things considered. As a follow-up to Operation C, Alien Wars proved to be a step upwards with more weapons, bosses, and varied set pieces to traverse, and the Super Game Boy enhancements makes it worthwhile if you have one of those laying around, and I do. A bunch, actually. And of course, given that this is a conversion of a 16-bit title and having to make a few concessions for this to even be possible, Konami and Factor 5 turned out a respectable outing here, and that's something to be commended. Now, in a day and age where the actual Contra 3 can be played on a number of handheld devices without compromise, Alien Wars on Game Boy might seem like more of a novelty than anything these days, but that's its own little thing. It's perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable Contra fare. Now, as of this recording, this hasn't seen much of a re-release, and the cart itself, while not overly expensive, isn't exactly cheap, but if you do get a chance to give this game a shot, go for it. So long as you keep your expectations in check, you'll be fine.